Good evening and thank you for joining us. I'm Haylee Ficuciello, Senior Correspondent for Englebrook Independent News, with this week's federal crime report covering significant cases announced in the United States Attorney's Office throughout the Southeast. Before we begin, it's important to note that criminal complaints and indictments are allegations only. Every defendant is presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty in the court of law beyond reasonable doubt. Cases involving guilty pleas, jury verdicts, and sentencings are identified accordingly. All information presented in tonight's report is attributed from the official announcement issued by the United States Department of Justice and respective United States Attorney's offices. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Maryland announced several significant federal prosecutions involving child exploitation and national security. A Talbot County man has been indicted by a federal grand jury on charges related to alleged production, distribution, and possession of child sexual abuse material. The investigation was conducted by the FBI Baltimore Field Office in partnership with the Talbot County Sheriff's Office and the Talbot County State Attorney's Office. The case remains pending. In a separate matter, an Essex, Maryland man entered a guilty plea in a federal child exploitation offense involving a minor. According to the U.S. Attorney's Office, the investigation involved Homeland Security Investigation, the Maryland State Police, Army Criminal Investigation Division, and the Naval Criminal Investigation Services. Sentencing will occur at a later date. Also in Maryland, a federal jury sentenced 22-year-old man to 15 years in federal prison after he pled guilty to attempting to provide material supporting the foreign terrorist organization ISIS. Federal prosecutors stated that the investigation was led by the FBI Baltimore Field Office. Federal prosecutors announced the arrest and indictment of former college basketball player Kerr Kriisa on multiple wire fraud charges alleging a scheme to obtain approximately $2.2 million throughout fraudulent representation. The indictment remains an allegation, and the defendant is presumed innocent unless proven guilty in the court of law. In a separate sentencing proceeding, an Ohio man received a 10-year federal prison sentence after being convicted of possessing methamphetamine with intent to distribute following an investigation by the Marshall County Drug Task Force. Federal prosecutors also announced the sentencing of Joshua Carney for his role in a drug trafficking conspiracy operating in Ohio Valley, including distribution near a protected location. Additionally, Jamie Ann Tanner was sentenced to more than 12 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to trafficking significant quantities of methamphetamine. A former Newport News police officer has been indicted on federal civil rights charges allegedly depriving the rights of under color of law. The indictment following an investigation into alleged on-duty sexual assault. The case remains pending and the defendant is presumed innocent. Federal prosecutors also announced Jose Maria Hernandez Barraza was sentenced to 2 years and 9 months in prison after a conviction involving an aggravated identity theft and false statements conducted at passport fraud. According to the Department of Justice, the case included fraudulent voter registration and voting using another person's identity. In another case, a Woodbridge man pled guilty to possession of a firearm after prior felony convictions. Sentencing is scheduled for September. A Franklin youth soccer coach has been sentenced to 30 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to child exploitation offenses and immigration document fraud. The U.S. Attorney's Office stated the investigation involved multiple federal agencies. Federal authorities also announced the extradition of a fugitive from Guatemala to Tennessee to face state charges involving alleged child sexual assault. The extradition was conducted by the FBI, federal prosecutors, and international law enforcement partners. Those charges remain pending in the state court. In Clarksville, a Fort Campbell soldier pled guilty to multiple federal child exploitation offenses following an FBI investigation involving victims in several states. Federal prosecutors announced that a Northampton County man has been sentenced to 35 years in prison for a series of armed gas station robberies committed in eastern North Carolina. In another case, Kevin Ural received a 14-year federal sentence after pleading guilty to cocaine trafficking and illegal firearm possession. Authorities also announced that Kirby Pata of Florida was sentenced to more than 12 years in prison for leading a multi-state drug trafficking organization that distributed cocaine and methamphetamine throughout several eastern states. A federal jury sentenced Terry Dewan Makun to 30 years in prison after a jury found him guilty for transporting a minor across state lines to engage in unlawful sexual activity. Federal officials also know he has received additional sentencing for violating supervised release to run currently. The investigation also involved the FBI Child Abduction Response Team and multiple local law enforcement agencies in Mississippi and Tennessee. Federal judges imposed lengthy prison sentences in several firearm and narcotic cases. Robert Garrett received more than 10 years in prison after pleading guilty to federal firearm and drug trafficking offenses. Derry DeJuan Zingler was sentenced to more than 7 years for illegally possessing a firearm as a convicted felon. Francis William received a 20-year federal sentence after pleading guilty to methamphetamine trafficking and firearm offenses. These investigations were conducted by federal authorities working alongside the Birmingham Police Department and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearm, and Explosives. Federal prosecutors announced major developments in 2 separate fentanyl trafficking investigations. 2 defendants were sentenced to lengthy federal prison terms after pleading guilty to participating in a drug trafficking conspiracy involving fentanyl and synthetic cannabis. Additional defendants have pled guilty and awaiting trial, while 2 defendants charged in the indictment remain fugitives. Those pending charges remain allegations. In a separate Homeland Security Task Force investigation, a federal jury convicted 2 defendants on numerous fentanyl and methamphetamine trafficking charges following a trial. 14 additional defendants remain charged, and those cases are still pending. Authorities report substantial seizures of narcotics, firearms, and cash during the investigation. Former Charleston County Magistrate James Benjamin Gonzalez Jr. pled guilty to federal charges involving possession and distribution of child sexual abuse material following an investigation led by the Homeland Security investigation. Separately, 2 individuals were sentenced in connection in a public corruption investigation involving former Simmonsburg County Sheriff. Federal courts imposed prison and probation sentence along with substantial restitution orders. Federal prosecutors announced that a Naples man has been sentenced to 4 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to wire fraud involving $1 million stolen from an elderly Hurricane Ian victim throughout the fraudulent contracting scheme. In Tampa, a New Jersey man received 3 years in federal sentence for robbing a United States Postal Service letter carrier and possessing stolen postal property. Finally, a Mexican national was indicted on charges of illegal re-entry after prior deportation. Federal prosecutors emphasized that the indictment is allegations and the defendant remains presumed innocent unless proven guilty in the federal court of law. That concludes this week's Federal Crime Report. The case highlighted tonight reflect the continued work of federal prosecutions, the FBI, Homeland Security Investigation, DEA, ATF, U.S. Postal Inspection Services, local law enforcement agencies, and numerous federal task force working all together throughout the southeast United States. As always, Englebrook Independent News reminds our viewers that indictments and criminal complaints are accusations only. Every defendant is presumed innocent until proven guilty in the court of law. Guilty pleas, jury verdicts, and sentencings have been identified separately throughout the report. All information presented this evening has been summarized from official press releases issued by the United States Department of Justice and the respective United States Attorney's Office. For continued coverage of federal law enforcement, public safety, and the justice system, visit Englebrook Independent News. I'm Haylee Ficuciello. Thank you for watching and have a safe evening.